With its economy in a virtual free fall, Thailand received an emergency rescue loan from the International Monetary Fund. When that didn't work, the Thai government asked Washington for even more help. No one imagined that an economy as small as Thailand's could spark a global crisis.
Thailand is a very small economy. It doesn't have a lot of links, and it's not exactly in your backyard. In any event, the U.S. chose not to intervene in Thailand, thinking it was not going to spill over. Why would it? The contagion effects were not apparent to anybody, not just the administration.
I think they misjudged the situation. And probably because it was seen too much as a financial issue rather than an overall strategic issue.
Global markets worried that other Asian countries might have similar hidden flaws. Like a classic run on the bank, money began to pull out of the entire region. They called it Contagion.
And at each stage, the crisis turned out to have a virulence, which became known as contagion, much greater than had been anticipated. And what that really reflected was indeed globalization, was the way these economies had become locked together, and investors looked at emerging markets. They said there's a problem in Thailand, well then there's a problem in these other countries. And so each step of the crisis created these shock waves that carried on into the next.
Contagion spread to Thailand's neighbors. Malaysia's economy had seemed stable. Suddenly, it too was facing relentless pressure from global markets.
We have the currency going down and down and down, and we have the stock market doing the same. And we felt totally helpless. We feel that there is no way we can recover. So, I mean, the feeling is really very bad, very frightening.
Contagion next hit Indonesia, the most populous country in the region. Its government collapsed. Its cities descended into chaos.
The fund managers didn't know the difference between Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, Singapore. They just say, I want out. Property prices collapse, companies collapse. And in the case of Indonesia, the social fabric collapsed. Churches have been burned, mosques have been attacked. They have killed each other. And it's all the fallout of an economic collapse.
This was a new kind of financial crisis, unlike anything the International Monetary Fund had ever encountered. The IMF organized huge loans for Indonesia and other Asian nations, on the condition they cut government spending, raise interest rates, and eliminate corruption.
You are the doctor going in to deal with a very sick patient. The public blames the doctor for the fact that the patient is sick, but the patient was sick to begin with. But these things are societally wrenching, and there are huge vested interests. And you wouldn't get into these crises if the vested interests weren't that important. That, I think, is one of the reasons why it takes political change to deal with a crisis as big as this.
To some of the region's entrenched leaders, the IMF's conditions smacked of a new kind of colonialism.
Presently, we see a well-planned effort to undermine the economies of all the ASEAN countries by destabilizing their currencies.
In the old days, you need to conquer a country with military force, and then you can control that country. Today, it is not necessary at all. You can destabilize a country, make it poor, and then make it request for help. And for the help that is given, you gain control over the policies of a country. And when you gain control over the policies of a country, effectively, you have colonized that country.
The market forces were simply too powerful for the IMF or any government to contain. In late 1997, Contagion reached Korea, one of the most successful economies in the world.
It was unbelievable that the crisis has spread as quickly as to Indonesia and Korea within a matter of 6 months or 7 months. But the world was much more globalized than we thought it was at that time.
In the last week of December of 1997, the 11th largest economy in the world, which was Korea, had, roughly speaking, 4 billion of reserves left and was using reserves at the rate of $1 billion a day. Well, it didn't take a great deal of quantitative insight to see that that was not a long-term viable situation.
Korea had been misleading the world, claiming it had enough money to withstand the crisis. The IMF's Stanley Fischer arrived in Seoul to inspect the central bank's accounts.
I visited Korea a couple of days before they turned to the IMF for help. And there was a state of panic. And it was at that point that I went to the central bank and was shown how much money was left in the Korean central bank. It was essentially all gone.
Korea was about to default on its loans from Japanese and Western banks. Pressured by their governments, the banks agreed to share some of the pain. They rolled over their loans. Korea was then given the largest bailout in history.
If they had done that in Thailand, I think that they would have not only avoided some economic problems, but I think that the sense in Southeast Asia that the Americans were really on the side of putting things right would have been stronger.
Then a very, very strange thing happened. From about the 1st of February 1998 until August, there was a period in which financial markets essentially decided that risk didn't exist anywhere.
Markets thought contagion had been contained in Asia. Investment flowed elsewhere. Some came to Russia, where the Moscow stock market was the best performing in the world. But economic reforms had stalled, and Russia was heavily in debt. Even so, investors were convinced they'd found an emerging market that couldn't fail.
Investors had decided Russia is an ex-superpower. It has lots of missiles and lots of atomic warheads for them. Certainly you could not have a financial accident in Russia because the rest of the world, the rich countries, would bail Russia out. Well, it turned out that that was wrong.
Russia defaulted on its debt. Its currency plummeted. Global investors were stunned.
All these people who in the previous 7 months had decided there was no risk anywhere literally panicked and decided there's got to be massive risk everywhere. Behind each fence and barnyard wall, there must be a risk that we hadn't thought of, kind of like the redcoats retreating from Lexington.
Everywhere, markets were freezing up. The economic crisis seemed to have taken on a life of its own.
I thought at the time that I had a pretty good sense of what was going on, but what I didn't know, and nobody could possibly have known, was not what was going on at the moment that you were looking at, but what was going to happen at the next moment.
Well, when you get in a room with both Alan Greenspan and Robert Rubin and they say they're scared to death, and they've never seen anything like this, and they're worried about whether or not we can get through it. I get worried because they know a heck of a lot more about it than I do. You had the contagion sweeping across all the developing countries. As Reuben said, we've never seen that before. I mean, maybe in the Depression they saw that over a period of time, but nothing that happened that quickly.
Now the crisis had reached America. A little-known but powerful private investment fund was on the brink of bankruptcy. Long-term Capital Management, or LTCM, directly controlled $100 billion of global assets and indirectly more than $1 trillion.
The 90s saw a huge buildup in concentrations that we had never seen on a global scale. Maybe we had way back in history. Maybe the Romans had financial institutions that were disproportionately large to the overall activity of the world that they operated in. But LTCM was a specific type of hedge fund. They were involved, whether it was the Singapore Exchange, the Tokyo Stock Exchange, the London Stock Exchange, the New York. There was no market that they weren't maybe the largest player or close to the largest player.
By September 1998, LTCM's losses were spiraling out of control. Contagion had arrived on Wall Street. Incredibly, the failure of this single investment fund threatened the entire global economy.
If LTCM went down, it would be just the gears, the machine just stopping, the economy not working. And of course, it's not just what's on the balance sheet of banks and so forth, but that would translate into people not working, businesses not operating, small businesses not being able to get the capital they need, and this a global economy that almost inconceivable to see what the picture, but sort of just not working, and people just not working.
The New York Federal Reserve summoned representatives of major U.S. and European banks to an urgent meeting. John Corzine, then at Goldman Sachs, was among them.
The real problem with long-term capital was nobody really understood all the downsides. All one knew was it was going to be extraordinarily dangerous to enter into that. And everybody, I think, understood the Fed's concern that that had real implications to the real economy.
Since LTCM was a private fund, the government could not impose a solution. The fate of the global economy was in the hands of these bankers.
The head of a securities firm or a bank is not paid to be a patriot. He or she is paid to serve the best interests of the shareholders. So the most that one can do in a position like mine is to say the public interest may well be served by long-term capital management not failing. But there is no public sector money to solve the problem. The taxpayer is not going to do this. You folks have to decide whether it's in your interest to do it.
The banks agreed to put up their own money to rescue LTCM. Wall Street had averted disaster, but the global crisis had one final chapter to go. What had started in Asia now reached Brazil, the 8th largest economy in the world.